there never seemed to be a huge issue with warfare in general among the church fathers, because they did pray for the state, and they did pray for soldiers. If you remember the prayer that I read from the second week, that I believe it was Tertullian gave, it was pretty specific about the defeat of the enemy.
Yeah, I was going to say they specifically prayed for the success of a war.
Right. It wasn't just, that soldiers would, come to the Lord, but it was that soldiers would kill the enemy. All right. But the issue again was with Christians. And Aquinas doesn't beat around the bush. He goes straight to this issue. And he presents, as well as any of the church fathers who absolutely supported that position, he presents that view. He quotes the scripture, and he says, this is the issue. This is exactly the issue. Now, I mentioned last week, as I was praising Augustine, that Aquinas does what when he answers his critics? The first thing he does is quote Augustine. In Article 1, his very first question, whether it is always sinful to engage in warfare, he quotes Augustine 8 times. In fact, he really essentially parrots Augustine at the beginning and says, look, this is what Augustine said on it, so this is sort of where we are. But he elaborates on it, but you really see how much he relies on St. Augustine when he's discussing whether or not it's always sinful to engage in warfare. Now later on, he's going to quote the man he refers to as the philosopher. Who might that be? Aristotle. Right. There are times when he completely goes to the philosopher and doesn't quote Augustine at all, which is pretty fascinating as well. But he quotes him 8 times. And what does he say to the idea that those who live by the sword die by the sword? One of the great objections the church fathers had to Christians fighting in warfare. How many? If you didn't read it last night, it's perfectly okay. But if anybody did and wants to jump in, like maybe Rick and Nancy. Okay.
You're going to find your part.
I'm kidding. Feel free to jump in. But one reason that I'm kind of pushing us along here is because there are 2 areas that Aquinas talks about just war that I think are just fascinating, and I want to open the floor for discussion in those 2 areas. So that's sort of why we're plodding along a little bit quickly, is to set that up. But for anybody that did read it or who is familiar with this, please do jump in. Okay.
Well, I have a comment.
Yes,
I think this occurred to me on the way in this morning. I think you want to distinguish when Jesus is addressing individuals, what applies to individuals and what applies to the sovereign. Those are 2 different things, because the sovereign acts with God's authority in the name of, for the nation, for the good of the nation. But the individual, how the individual is supposed to act towards other individuals is another question. Also, are we talking about how individuals should act toward brother Christians?
Right.
Those are all, factors I think that you have to use to filter this.
They're absolutely factors, and this is exactly what both Augustine and Aquinas explain. Because this was one of the issues with the early church fathers was, what do the Beatitudes mean? What does it mean when the Bible says those who live by the sword will perish by the sword? And this is precisely what, in fact, it's in this article where Aquinas says there's a difference. Romans 13 itself talks about, he that beareth the sword not in vain. So that when you're bearing the sword on the commission of the state, that is entirely different than when you're bearing the sword as an individual and engaging in individual avenging, And Aquinas goes back also to the verse that in the Gospels where Jesus says to Peter, "Put up thy sword, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword." This was a huge issue for the early church fathers. But what Aquinas said was 2 things, and one of them is exactly what Father Ed said, which I think is exactly what the just war doctrine is taught, and that is that living by the sword and dying by the sword refers to the individual, not to the state. But the other thing that Aquinas said is that when Jesus said to Peter, "Put up your sword," what might have been the significance of him saying that to Peter? What else might that have meant? It's really fascinating. the idea that Peter, this is what Aquinas says, Peter represents bishops. Okay? So that when Jesus says to Peter, put up thy sword, he's speaking to Peter as the the chief bishop,
He
essentially.
charges him to be the bishop.
Right, and we're skipping a little bit to Article 2, but this is where the question is raised whether it was lawful for clerics to fight. This is where Aquinas says it is not lawful, and one reason that we know it's not lawful is that Jesus commissioned Peter to put up the sword as the representative for all clergy to follow. So that's sort of two ways. Yes.
When he says those that live by the sword die by the sword, he's not necessarily forbidding using a sword. Isn't he just warning you that if you use a sword, you're going to get killed with a sword? You live violently, you'll die violently.
Could be. He did say to put up thy sword.
Right. I mean, I know that, but he's just warning him that if you use a sword,
Right.
you will die by a sword.
Right. Yeah, that could be. That he's saying if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. And if I recall, I think Augustine talked about this being a metaphor. Not necessarily a metaphor, the sword being sort of the sinful ways of the world. If I recall correctly, it was Augustine. One of the church fathers talked about the sword being sort of metaphorical for how the sin of the world eventually will cause all people to die. But I'm not positive if that was Augustine or not. Okay, any other questions right now about this notion of, because that's a great point Father Ed brought up, and I think this is the crux really of the working out of what it means, this living by the sword, dying by the sword, put up thy sword, turn the other cheek. This is sort of the working out of that, yes.
When he said to turn the other cheek, is he referring specifically to self-defense, or is it when you are attacked in his name, when somebody attacks you because you are defending your faith or living for him? I mean, we're studying the ancients, and I've been thinking about the way the Christians, the early Christians were called to recant.
Right.
And they wouldn't, and it was specifically as a Christian you were being killed. So is that different than you're on the highway and robbers attack you, and somebody thought about, well, if you don't defend yourself, then your children are left as orphans.
Right. This is okay. What is? Remember what we talked about that Augustine said last week? What would Augustine have said to that? That's a great question, because we're about to see a difference between Augustine and Aquinas. The question is, what about the case? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that self-defense refers to essentially Christian persecution versus defending yourself when you're attacked by robbers on the road. Does anybody remember what Augustine would say to that question?
Augustine would have said, don't defend yourself if you're being persecuted, but perhaps you could defend yourself if you're protecting someone else.
If you're protecting someone else.
When it has nothing to do with whether you're a Christian or not, they just want your money.
Right. Augustine, I think, would say, if it's self-defense and self-defense only, you cannot defend yourself. Now, yes.
Isn't that one of the main points at which Augustine broke with the early church fathers? Because the early church fathers said even self-defense you can't do anything.
Okay, yeah, there's a spectrum here. And if we look at the early church fathers and when they talk about pacifism, they are talking, I think, about the fact that you absolutely cannot defend yourself, and a Christian cannot engage in warfare. Now, when we move towards Augustine says you cannot defend yourself. However, you can most certainly, and you often have a duty to defend others, and you certainly and often, particularly if you're an able-bodied male who is not a clergy member, you may have a duty to serve in the military and to fight in the military. When we get to Aquinas, okay, so here with Augustine, we've got self-defense is still the pacifism. That's what pacifism is in the prohibition against self-defense. When you're by yourself and you're walking down the road and the robbers attack you. Now, if you're with your family, let's say you're the male of your family, certainly you would defend your family and defend yourself in the process, because that's your duty to defend others. Aquinas says self-defense is perfectly legitimate. In fact, and this is where we see some of his Aristotelian philosophy come out, this idea of having a will to live, the goodness of life, sort of, I guess that's the best way to put it, is that we naturally have a will to live, and this is something that is God-given, and because of that, we have a duty and the right to defend ourselves if we are attacked.